It's true that what is said, you are what you eat. What you put in your mouth does affect your soul and the internal parts of your body. Contrary to what popular belief is that whatever you eat, it really doesn't affect you. It just gets processed and the waste goes out. It does affect you. And one of the things in Jewish law that we've come to learn is that God has provided for us dietary laws that will in fact help the soul. The idea of holiness is reinforced in the Torah relating to the laws and cautions against defilement of the opposite of holiness. And for not only the forbidden creatures designated as tamaim, but also Israel is repeatedly warned not to defile itself and not to make itself impure, tamaim, with them, as we see in Leviticus chapter 14, verse 43 through 44. The emphasis upon holiness as a reason for the purpose of kashrut regulation deserves to be better understood and appreciated in an integral part of the entire picture of Judaism. And it has many, many ramifications to distinguish between the beast which is to be eaten and the beast which is not to be eaten, we're told in Leviticus chapter 11, verse 47. It is also an aspect of a broader requirement that Israel learns to distinguish between the unclean and the clean, the tahor and the tamai, not only in food, but in all areas of life, whether it be sexual, whether it be moral, whether it be ethical or spiritual. The laws of kashrut do not stand isolated, and many times when we do that, it really becomes distorted and the misunderstanding follows thereafter. In Judaism, holiness does not only mean ascetic, saintly withdrawal from life. Holiness does not insist upon the self-denial of any legitimate human pleasures, nor the total repression of any of the bodily drives, but neither does it condone self-indulgence, gluttony, drunkenness, which are hallmarks of stubborn rebelliousness and incorrigible aspects as a son that is completely irreprehensible, as we see in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 18 through 21. They were regarded as abominations. The lack of self-control and the readiness to satisfy one's craving, regardless of the merit, propriety, and legality, were indicative of spiritual weakness and moral decay. Holiness means becoming master over one's passion, so that one is in command and control of them and not they of him. The one who has been trained to resist the cravings of for the forbidden foods and tempt him may also be strengthened in the capacity to resist his craving for forbidden sexual involvements, and that may tempt him too. It also may also strengthen him to the capacity to resist forbidden and unethical actions that may hold forth a promise of tempting financial or status rewards. The transference of this religious discipline to other areas is not guaranteed, but there is no denying the inherent value of religious discipline intended to train one to resist the bodily drive and to urge just to satisfy a craving or experience a pleasure. The biblical call to holiness is reflected by Judaism's attempt to elevate the satisfaction of all basic urges for food and drink, sex, and which we differ not from beasts onto a level worthy of a man. So, for example, kashrut is a good example of how Judaism raises even the most mundane acts to a level higher than this world, the most routine activity into a religious experience. Whatever narrow minds look upon as pikayun concerning the trifling kitchen matters is really an example of how Judaism elevates mere physical satisfaction of one's appetite into a spiritual act by its emphasis of the ever-present God and our duty to serve Him at all times. The table upon which the food is served became identified in Jewish tradition and thought with the temple's altar. When the temple stood, sacrifice would secure the atonement for an individual. Now his table does that. His own table, which he serves food according to Hagigah 27a. And this was the way it was put by the Talmudic sages. This symbolic identification explains widespread customs among Jews of not sitting down upon a table, and explains the custom among some of sprinkling salt upon the first morsel of bread that was to be eaten, just as was required in ancient sacrifice, or removing all knives from the table before the recitation of grace, because the knives are symbol of sword and war and violence, and were forbidden on the altar, a symbol, literally, of peace and of harmony. Even if it was one of the reasons given to the ritual washing before the meal, which is done not only for the reason of cleanliness, but also symbolizes the ritual purity required of the priests when they were officiating the offering. Even during the meal, we are directed to raise the level of our conversation as befitting the sacred symbolism of the table. In other words, we shouldn't have vulgar conversation at the table. We should be properly dressed, not without clothes. And three who eat together with no words of Torah that are exchanged is as they ate from a pagan offering. But if three have eaten at the table and spoke words of Torah, it is as though they ate at the table of the Lord. It's like God was eating at the table. Pirkei Avot, chapter 2, verse 4. Birkat Hamazon, the grace after the meal, in fact, is the minimal satisfaction of this requirement. But the imagery is also in terms of an altar. The very act of eating is a form of offering to God, at which the appropriate prayer are recited before and after. As the table is sanctified through blessings and prayers said around it, so goes it on it. The Jews is taught that even though he sits down to eat, he must be aware of his master and serve him faithfully. As it was forbidden to bring certain animals upon the altar to God, so it is forbidden to do so upon the table. And thus the laws of kashrut, what is permitted for us to eat, became a force in our Jewish daily life. In all of your ways, we are told by Shlomo HaMelech in Proverbs chapter 3, verse 6, in all of your ways know him or acknowledge him, and he shall direct your path. But this does not sufficiently explain why some think were picked for prohibition, some were not. Was it just divine caprice? In same disciplinary and spiritual effects might have been achieved if prohibited were permitted and permitted prohibited. Torah scholars saw significance to the specific regulations as well, where some saw some practical health benefit, others prescribed only high moral reasons to the specific regulation, emphasizing that the purpose of holiness was also involved in specific actions, in specific deed. The later saw prohibition against eating blood, for example, and eating of meat and milk together as a way by which to wean the Jews away from bloodshed and insensitivity to the feelings of a living creature. How else are we to explain the prohibition against slaughtering an animal or its offspring on the same day, as we read in Leviticus chapter 22, verse 28? Similarly, the inculcation of more refined values was held to be the basis of the prohibition against eating swarming and crawling things. Dr. Samuel Belkin, in his essay, The Philosophy of Purpose, contends that the religious philosophy of purpose teaches us that certain foods are forbidden not primarily for reasons of health and hygiene, although these may be very beneficial by the byproduct of their observance, but for a higher moral reason. The unclean foods best besets the soul, preventing its moral and spiritual virtues, is also the way Sforno commentary on the Torah puts it, as we read the commentary of Sforno on Leviticus chapter 11, verse 2. Now the critics of kashrut are heard to remark that it's not what goes into your mouth that counts, but what comes out. And I hasten to add that what comes out may well be determined in the long run by what goes in. And it may also be in the long run the food the people eat or abstain from eating, people perhaps even more so, does have an influence over our character as a people, some of the values and moral ethical sensitivity. And thus, the Jewish critic, particularly among the reformers, who cast off the discipline of kashrut altogether with all of the other halakhic guidelines, have been criticized in its observance of on the ground. It tends to separate us from the other people in other faith because social intercourse more difficult. Yet in addition to whatever other merits it may pose, we know that the purpose of kashrut may have, for all we know, this too may be part of the Almighty's intention. For the barriers to totally social integration in a non-Jewish environment are also barriers to intermarriage and assimilation that we see so high in our days. We find the connection between the separation and kashrut even more explicitly delineated in the following passage. I am the Lord your God, who have set you apart from the other nations. And you shall therefore separate between the clean beast and the unclean, between the unclean fowl and the clean, according to Leviticus chapter 20, verse 24 through 25. That the breakdown in kashrut observance has been a strong contributing factor to the increase in intermarriage and assimilation is also part of this dynamic. And it's evident in our society. When the need to seek out kosher facility is eliminated, especially when young people leave home for any length of time, the opportunity for meeting and developing camaraderie with fellow Jews needing the same facilities are reduced. And thus, by not asserting this distinctive norms on a day-in, day-out basis, the fertile conditions for assimilation is automatically set up. While the strict observance of kashrut is not really a barrier to cordial relations with people of all nations and all faith, it does provide perhaps just enough to enable Israel to remain in its distinctive self, its distinctive identity. A small nation that is committed to its perpetuation must also maintain the struggle against the absorption and assimilation into the larger group, should welcome observance and discipline that set up some barriers and it sets up the potential of self-annihilation. So we must keep these barriers up on high. What distinguishes the Jew among all other people is what and how he eats. I like to compare kashrut to the foundation of a house. In and of itself, a foundation is not a home, but one cannot take up residence there. But on the other hand, a house built without foundations, upon weak foundation, has no permanence whatsoever. It can easily collapse upon the slightest pressure. Kashrut, too, by itself does not make for a Jewish home, nor for a Jewish life, nor for the holiness which is primary purpose. No, kashrut too, it by itself does not make a Jewish home or its primary purpose, but an attempt to build such an edifice without kashrut is to build very weakly. Shabbat, the festivals, the family life, the walls, the roof, the furnishing, and all is of our edifice will be unsteady and in danger of collapse without proper foundation. And kashrut, eating kosher, is part of that foundation. The religious training and spiritual development of children is also endangered without kashrut. Without kashrut, development of the children in thrills at the sight of a child becoming home from Hebrew school only to be reciting a bracha, a blessing for a food for which he commanded him not to eat. And unfortunately, this has happened so many times where we're supposed to say blessings over the foods, and some of the foods that are given, it's not even kosher, so you're not supposed to say a blessing. So, except for this rare case, it's not prohibited food he will give up, but the blessings that he will stop reciting. The religious and spiritual awareness that the parents were so anxious for the child to have become empty. Nor does the double standard practiced by some Jewish families promote all the spiritual goals and purpose with which kashrut is concerned. Keeping a kosher home, unfortunately, is no longer identical with observing kashrut. Eating like a Jew at home and like a Gentile outside the home leads to a ridiculous situation where some Jews are more particular about what goes onto their own household dishes than what goes into their stomach. In what other areas of life we wonder our children led to believe that one could have a set of standards exist at home and another outside. While I wouldn't condemn this is hypocrisy, but regard it as an attempt to hold on to something a little bit better than nothing, it is true, none of the reason for observing kashrut are met by this double standard of keeping kosher at home and not keeping it outside. In summary, let me say that kashrut in itself does not make for holiness, for it's an integral part of the entire pattern that makes for a distinctive life, which includes Shabbat and the festivals, which include ethical and moral norms, which includes sexual disciplines and guidelines, and observing kashrut is an indispensable element. Now let's get right to it, the forbidden foods. So let's take a look at the forbidden food list, which we look at it right now. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shehakol nihiya bidvaro. The chapter that you should read in the Torah or in the Bible that speaks about foods that are not permitted for us to eat is found in chapter 11 of Leviticus and chapter 14, verse 2 through 21 of Deuteronomy. The list of those animals and fish and fowls which are permitted to be eaten and those which are forbidden to be eaten. Only animals that possess a dual characteristic, cloven hooves, and chewing the cud are permitted. All others are forbidden. Let me say that again. Two basic characteristics of eating kosher animal is that if the animal chews its cud and has cloven hooves. Lest the presence of one of the characteristics be regarded as sufficient, those animals possessing only cloven hooves or are only cud chewing are singled out by name for being forbidden. Such is the case with the pig, with the camel, with the hare, the rabbit, the rocket badger. Animals possessing the characteristics that designated them as clean or designated as clean are sheep, cattle, goats, deer. These are typical animals that is considered kosher. In cattle, we're talking about a cow, so forth. Now, only fish that possesses a dual characteristics also is what's considered kosher. So the question you ask when you buy fish at the store, does it have fins and does it have scales? If they do, they're permitted to eat. All others are forbidden. Now, there's some common seafood which is definitely prohibited in the Bible, such things as lobster, oysters, shrimp, clams, and crabs. Now, some will say to me, well, shrimp I can't let go. It's so delicious. Just think of it this way. Shrimp and lobster and some of these other mentioned, they're actually the cockroaches of the sea. Now, would you eat a cockroach? Think about that. Now, there are swordfishes and sturgeons which have had disputable halakhic rulings, some against and some in favor. Swordfish and sturgeon definitely has scales when they're in the water. But when you take them out of the water, their scales are gone. They disappear. So many authorities have ruled against them, but many authorities in the Sephardic world has ruled in favor. For example, the swordfish in particular, because they had scale and they do have fins, they meet the basic areas of being a kosher fish. But those who rely that, well, we didn't see them when they took them out of the water and therefore has no scales, they also have what to rely on as well. Swordfish and sturgeons are not my appetite, not my best type of fish. Give me snapper, give me rain trout, give me a whole bunch of, even tilapia. But they have to have those two elements at some time in the process. If you're a person who likes swordfish, and you know that when they take them out of the water, the scales fall off, and you're Sephardic, you should have no problem partaking of a swordfish. Of course, your Ashkenazic brother or brethren may take a look and go, Is this person eating something not kosher? So keep that in mind as well. But sturgeon and swordfish, there is a dispute halakhically till this day, because the majority of those who posek in the Jewish world are Ashkenaz and not Sephardic. Therefore, they will rule against it. Now, among the fowls, no specific characteristics to distinguish the permitted birds from the prohibited one are given in the Torah. Instead, they are identified by the name and species and the 24 hours in all. From those listed in the Torah and the Talmud, they are birds of prey, or one that treats their food as do birds of prey. They include vultures. We don't eat vultures. Ravens. We don't eat ravens. Hawk. We don't eat hawk. Owls. We don't eat owls. Ostriches. Neither. Pelicans. Neither. Storks and herons we don't eat. Those that are permitted are such things that are fowl that are traditionally been identified as chicken, turkey, geese, ducks, dove, and even quails. Amphibian creatures and insects are prohibited as all of the living creatures that crawl or creep upon the belly. So, for example, in this category we have snakes. We have winged swarming things. We have also rodents, rats, lizards, ants. These are all areas in which are detestable. You shall not defile yourselves with them. And when it says detestable, it means it's abominable. Leviticus chapter 11, verse 42 and 43. Such gourmet delicacies as eels and snails and rattlesnakes and ants and assorted insects are also prohibited by the Torah. Crocodile, you like a crocodile? Not kosher. All creatures permitted as foods are referred to in the Torah as tahor, pure, clean. Not because they are filthy, but rather because they provide an impurity in the soul. These are kosher, which by means are fit or proper in accordance with the law. All four forbidden creatures are referred to as tamai, impure, defiled, or unclean, and therefore they are referred to as shekets, detestable things, and as to'eva, abomination. These are non-kosher creatures. The term treifa, however, commonly applied to them, really refers to any meat that is not ritually fit, which means that perhaps the slaughterer had a nick on his blade and therefore affected the slaughtering process. That meat is considered treifa, nevila. There's no way of making them kosher and therefore cannot be eaten. It needs to be sold out, and normally they sell those carcasses to the non-Jewish trade. Products which comes from a non-kosher creature are also non-kosher. So an ostrich that makes lays these big eggs, because the animal is not kosher, so is its byproduct, which is the egg. Products from which comes non-kosher creatures are also not kosher. Eggs from non-kosher birds are forbidden. Milk from non-kosher animals is also forbidden. Oils from non-kosher fish is also forbidden. The only exception to this rule has to do with honey from the bees, from which the Torah specifically allows us to. It should also perhaps be clarified that the bees produce the honey from the nectar of the flowers. The Jewish religious code also includes some purely hygienic regulations. Issues of sarkana. A food known to be harmful to the health must not be eaten, even if it's permissible under all the other rules of kashrut. Some food is prescribed by the rabbis to be dangerous foods, as well as being an issue of sarkana, of health. The basis of this prohibition is found in the biblical passage, "For your sake, therefore, be most careful." In other words, just because it may be kosher doesn't mean it's good for you. For example, a barracuda, completely kosher. You have the scales, you have the fins, but not everybody eats it because the body of the fish is poisonous, according to many of the experts of fishing or fish. Now let's take a look now regarding the requirement of shahita. Shahita is the slaughtering of the animal. The Torah prohibits any eating of any clean creature which died of natural death or roadkill, or which had been killed in any other way other than by ritual slaughter. Shechita. You shall not eat anything that has died of a natural death. This is completely declared in Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 21. Such carcasses are called nevela or treifa. You shall not slaughter, or you shall slaughter of your cattle and your sheep, as I have instructed you, and you may eat. Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 21. Now, interesting enough, we find another reason why the Karaites are so wrong in not accepting the tradition of Moses, the oral law. Here's an example where we can cite that the instruction that was given to Moses was handed down. So how do we kill the animal? Do we take a sledgehammer and bash his head? No. There was a process that was taught by God to Moses and to the Jewish people. This is why it says very clearly, as I have instructed you, you may eat. Deuteronomy 12:21. Which means that there is an oral tradition, an oral teaching that was passed down from one generation to another generation of how to slaughter the meat properly. What is slaughtered in accordance with such instructions may be eaten, and what is not, it is forbidden. The details of this instructed, authorized method of slaughter, known as shechita, was transmitted through the oral Torah, and thus many of the those who are Karaites, they invent them at the whiz. Either that or they follow the Jewish practice of the tradition, which tells us how it's done. And so here we have a major issue regarding kosher eating of meat by people who do not follow the oral law. This includes the Muslims, who basically they slaughter similarly but don't follow the oral Jewish tradition of how to do it and all the processes of how to conduct it. This is why for us, halal is really chilul, not halal. It's basically forbidden for Jews to eat halal meat, which you'll find it in Wendy's and other establishments that have been able to persuade the business to only offer halal meat. It's great for the non-Jewish people because it's considered non-kosher meat. Alrighty, which means not permitted. Okay, it's only this method of slaughter by which clean animals or birds retain their kashrut level and they remain fit to be eaten. The requirements of ritual slaughter applies only to meat and fowl, not to fish. Why? The very moment you take out the fish from out of water, you already slaughtered it, as it were. Torah specifically excludes fish when it declares the flock and the herds to be slaughtered for them, the fish of the sea to be gathered for them. So once you gather fish together, they're considered already slaughtered, as it were. Numbers chapter 11, verse 21. This method of ritual slaughter is designed to cause the least pain to the animal and remove as much blood as possible. By the way, talking about fish, the blood of the fish is permitted to eat because it's not considered in the same category. It also consists of a rapid to and fro of the throat by means of a perfectly sharpened blade and adequate length that is free from the slightest nick or unevenness. This is why you see they pass their nail over the edge of the knife to make sure there's no nick in the blade, and it's very sharp. And this swift movement that takes place, it is to quickly sever the trachea from the esophagus and the two vagus nerves, as well as both carotid arteries and the jugular vein. All available evidence that would indicate the consciousness is lost almost immediately, within 2 seconds after shechita. The cut itself is painless. We say painless because we don't know the pain that the animal suffers. There is pain. With death, any form of slaughter will be somewhat of a pain, but it will be quick and immediate. So just as an individual is cut by a razor-shaped blade, no pain is immediately felt until afterwards you put some water or alcohol or something, you burn. Same thing with the slit of the throat of the animal, and the awareness that only develops later when the blood is seen or the wound is rubbed. and that there is no pain during the seconds that may elapse on the consciousness that is completely lost. The world's most eminent physiologists and pathologists and other scientists has qualified to judge have declared that the Jewish method is absolutely humane. Methods promoted by Animal Protection Society, like using stun guns to paralyze the animal, actually inflicts injury severe enough and renders the animal treifa, and not only that, the cruelty that the animal suffers for being stunned before death. While such stunning may be preferable in the sense of cruelty, the pain inflicted by most non-kosher slaughtering is in relation to kosher slaughtering. The shechita cut itself may be regarded as an effective form of stunning because its effect is to produce an immediate insensibility. In addition to the humanness of shechita, the Jewish method carries with it another distinct advantage over the most other methods, and ensures complete and rapid draining of the blood from the animal rather than allowing the animal to congeal its blood within the meat. This contributes to keeping the prohibition against eating of blood. It is also undoubtedly true that the maximum of blood drainage has a hygienic benefit. The shochet is not just a Jewish slaughterman. No, he must be a pious person. He has to have a good moral conduct. He must possess a thorough knowledge of these portions of the Shulchan Aruch, which details the precise rules and regulations that may render the meat treifa, not kosher. He must pass a rigid examination and be duly certified by rabbinic authorities to exercise the function of a shochet. Because of his piety, his training, his background, the shochet is also often called upon, especially in smaller communities, to perform other duties of Jewish religious functions. The Jewish methods are goes all the way back to the biblical tradition in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 21. Its details are elaborated upon in the Talmud in Chulin chapter 1 and 2, and codified in the Shulchan Aruch Yoredeya chapter 1 through 28, which, by the way, Yoredeya is one of the sofers or sofrims that you must study in order to become a rabbi. Yep. And we're going to take a look at, in our next section, under dietary laws, the idea of koshering the meat. After the animal is slaughtered, how do we make sure that the meat is koshered? We'll take a look at that in our next video.